The empire was vast from the first, and conquest has added to its extent. Peter the Great ordered the compilation of charts, sent expeditions round the coast to collect particulars as to the climate, productions, and races of the different provinces of his empire, and at length he sent bearing upon the voyage which resulted in the discovery of the straits bearing his name. The example of the great emperor was followed by his successor, Catherine Roman II. She attracted learned men to her court and corresponded with the savants of the whole world. She succeeded in impressing the nations with a favorable idea of her subjects. Interest and curiosity were awakened, and the eyes of Western Europe were fixed upon Russia. It became recognized that a great nation was arising, and many doubts were entertained as to the result upon European interests. Prussia had already changed the balance of power in Europe by her victories under Frederick Roman II. Russia possessed resources of her own, not only in men, but in silver and riches of every kind, still unknown or untested. Thus it came to pass that publications concerning that country possessed an attraction for politicians, and those interested in the welfare of their country, as well as for the scientific men to whom descriptions of manners and customs foreign to their experience were always welcome. No work had hitherto excelled that of the naturalist Pallas, which was translated into French between 1788–1793. It was a narrative of a journey across several provinces of the Russian Empire. The success of this publication was well deserved. Peter Simon Pallas was a German naturalist who had been summoned to St. Petersburg by Catherine Roman II in 1668 and elected by her a member of the Academy of Sciences. She understood the art of enlisting him in her service by her favors. Pallas, in acknowledgment of them, published his account of fossil remains in Siberia. England and France had just sent expeditions to observe the transit of Venus. Russia, not to be behindhand, dispatched a party of learned men, of whom Pallas was one, to Siberia. 7 astronomers and geometers, 5 naturalists, and a large number of pupils made up the party, which was thoroughly to explore the whole of the vast territory. For 6 whole years Pallas devoted himself to the successive explorations of Orenburg upon the Jake, the rendezvous of the nomad tribes who wander upon the shores of the Caspian Sea; Guriel, which is situated upon the borders of the Great Lake which is now drying up; the Ural Mountains with their numberless iron mines; Tobolsk, the capital of Siberia, the province of Koliwan, upon the northern slopes of the Atlas; Krasnojarsk upon the Yenisei, and the immense lake of Baikali and Daya on the frontiers of China. He also visited Astrakhan, the Caucasus with its varied and interesting inhabitants, and finally he explored the Don, returning to St. Petersburg on the 30th of July, 1774. It may well be believed that Pallas was no ordinary traveler. He was not merely a naturalist. He was interested in everything that affects humanity: geography, history, politics, commerce, religion, science, art, all occupied his attention, and it is impossible to read his narrative without admiring his enlightened patriotism, or without recognizing the penetration of the sovereign who understood the art of securing his services. When his narrative was once arranged, written, and published, Pallas had no idea of contenting himself with the laurels he had gained. Work was his recreation, and he found occupation in assisting in the compilation of a map of Russia. His natural inclinations led him to the study of botany, and by his works upon that subject, he obtained a distinctive place among Russian naturalists. One of his later undertakings was a description of southern Russia, a physical and topographical account of the province of Taurus, a work which, originally published in French, was afterwards translated into English and German. Delighted with this country, which he had visited in 1793–94, he desired to settle there. The empress bestowed some of the crown lands upon him, and he transported his family to Simferopol. Pallas profited by the opportunity to undertake a new journey in the northern provinces of the empire, the steppes of the Volga, and the countries which border the Caspian Sea as far as the Caucasus. He then explored the Crimea. He had seen parts of the country 20 years before, and he now found great changes. Although he complains of the devastation of the forests, he commends the increase of agricultural districts and the centers of industries which had been created. The Crimea is known to be considerably improved since that time. It is impossible to foresee what it may yet become. Enthusiastic though he was at first in his admiration of this province, Pallas was exposed to every kind of treachery on the part of the Tartars. His wife died in the Crimea, and finally, disgusted with the country and its inhabitants, he returned to Breton to end his days. He died there on the 8th of September, 1811. He left two important works, from which naturalists, geographers, statesmen, and merchants were able to gather much trustworthy information upon countries then but little known, and the commodities and resources of which were destined to have a large influence over European markets. Chapter 4. The Two Americas. The Western Coast of America, Juan de Fuca and de Font, The Three Voyages of Bering and Tsiricahua, Exploration of the Straits of de Fuca, Survey of the Archipelago of New Georgia and of part of the American coast, Exploration of the Interior of America, Samuel Hearne Discovery of the Coppermine River, Mackenzie, and the river named after him, Fraser River, South America, Survey of the Amazon by Condamine, Journey of Humboldt and Bomplin, Tenerife, the Guacharo Cavern, the Llanos, the electric eels, the Amazon, Negro, and Orinoco rivers, the Earth Eaters, results of the journey, Humboldt's second journey, the volcanitos, or little volcanoes, the cascade at Tequendama, the bridge of Iconons, crossing the Brindisi on men's backs, Pinto and Pinchincha, ascent of Chimborazo, the Andes, Lima, the transit of Mercury, exploration of Mexico, Puebla, and Cofre de Peru, return to Europe. We have more than once had occasion to speak of expeditions for the survey of the coasts of America. We have told of the attempts of Fernando Cortez, and of the voyages and explorations of Drake, Cook, La Perouse, and Marchand. It will be well now to go back for a time, and with Fleurieu sum up the series of voyages along the western coast of America to the close of the 18th century. Map of Northwest America. In 1537, Cortez with Francisco de Aloa discovered the huge peninsula of California and sailed over the greater part of the long and narrow strait now known as the Vermilion Sea. He was succeeded by Vasquez Coronado and Francisco Alarcon, who, the former by sea and the latter by land, devoted themselves to seeking the channel which was erroneously supposed to connect the Atlantic and Pacific. They did not, however, penetrate Bayon degrees and lat. 2 years later, in 1542, the Portuguese Rodrigo de Cabrillo reached degrees and lat, where the intense cold, sickness, want of provisions, and the bad state of his vessel compelled him to turn back. He made no actual discovery, but he ascertained that from Port Natividad to the furthest point reached by him, the coastline was unbroken. The channel of communication seemed to recede before all explorers. The little success met with appears to have discouraged the Spaniards, for at this time they retired from the ranks of the explorers. It was an Englishman, Drake, who, after having sailed along the western coast as far as the Straits of Magellan and devastated the Spanish possessions, reached the 48th degree, explored the whole coast, and returning the same way, gave to the vast districts included within 10 degrees the name of New Albion. Next came, in 1592, the greatly fabulous voyage of Juan de Fuca, who claimed to have found the long-sought Strait of Anian, when he had but found the channel dividing Vancouver's island from the mainland. In 1602, Vizcaino laid the foundations of Port Monterey in California, and 40 years later took place that much contested voyage of Admiral de Fuente, or de Font according as one reckons him a Spaniard or a Portuguese, which has been the text of so many learned discussions and ingenious suppositions. To him, we owe the discovery of the archipelago of St. Lazarus above Vancouver's Island, but all that he says about the lakes and large towns he claims to have visited must be relegated to the realms of romance, as well as his assertion that he discovered a communication between the two oceans. Port Monterey. Port Monterey. Facsimile of early engraving. In the 18th century, the assertions of travelers were no longer blindly accepted. They were examined and sifted, those parts only being believed which accorded with the well-authenticated accounts of others. Buech, Delisle, and above all Fleurieu, inaugurated the prolific literature of historical criticism, and we have every reason to be grateful to them. The Russians, as we know, had greatly extended the field of their knowledge, and there was every reason to suppose that their hunters and Cossacks would soon reach America, if, as was then believed, the two continents were connected in the north. But from such unprofessional travelers, no trustworthy scientific details could be expected. A few years before his death, the Emperor Peter I drew up, with his own hands, a plan of an expedition, with instructions to its members, which he had long had in view, for ascertaining whether Asia and America are united or separated by a strait. The arsenal and forts of Kamchatka being unable to supply the necessary men, stores, and sea, captains, sailors, equipment, and provisions had to be imported from Europe. Vitus Bering, a Dane, and Alexis T. Skirikow, a Russian who had both given many a proof of skill and knowledge, were appointed to the command of the expedition, which consisted of two vessels built at Kamchatka. They were not ready to put to sea until July 20th, 1720. Steering northeast along the coast of Asia, of which he never for a moment lost sight, Bering discovered on the 15th August in 67 degrees 18 and lat, a cape beyond which the coast stretched away westwards. In this first voyage, Bering did not apparently see the coast of America, though he probably passed through the strait to which posterity has given his name. The fabulous Strait of Anian gave place to Bering Straits. A second voyage made by the same explorers the following year was without results. Not until June 4th, 1741, were Bering and T. Skirikow in a position to start again. This time, they meant to bear to the east after reaching 50 degrees and lat, till they should come to the coast of America. But the two vessels were separated in a gale of wind on the 28th August and were unable to find each other again throughout the trip. On the 18th July, Bering discerned the American continent in 58 degrees 28 and lat, and the succeeding days were devoted to the survey of the vast bay between Capes St. Elias and St. Hermogenes. Bering spent the whole of August in sailing about the islands known as the Shumagen Archipelago off the peninsula of Alaska, and after a struggle, lasting until the 24th September, with contrary winds, he sighted the most southerly cape of the peninsula and discovered part of the Aleutian group. Exhausted by long illness, however, the explorer was now no longer able to direct the course of his vessel, and could not prevent her from running aground on the little island bearing his name. There, on the 8th December, 1741, this brave man and skillful explorer perished miserably. The remnant of his crew, who survived the fatigues and privations of winter in this desolate spot, succeeded in making a large sloop of the remains of the vessel, in which they returned to Kamchatka. Meanwhile, T. Skirikow, after waiting for his superior officer until the 25th June, made land between 55 degrees 56 and lat, where he lost two boats with their crews, without being able to find out what had become of them. Unable after this catastrophe to open communication with the natives, he went back to Kamchatka. The way was now open, and adventurers, merchants, and naval officers eagerly rushed in, directing their efforts carefully to the Aleutian Islands and the peninsula of Alaska. The expeditions sent out by the English, and the progress made by the Russians, had, however, aroused the jealousy and anxiety of the Spanish, who feared lest their rivals should establish themselves in a country nominally belonging to Spain, though she owned not a single colony in it. The Viceroy of Mexico now remembered the discovery of an excellent port by Vizcaino and resolved to found a presidio there. Two expeditions started simultaneously, the one by land, under Don Gaspar de Partola, the other by sea, consisting of two packets, the San Carlos and San Antonio, and after a year's search found again the harbor of Monterey, alluded to by Vizcaino. After this expedition, the Spanish continued the exploration of the Californian coast. The most celebrated voyages were those of Don Juan de Gala and of La Bodega, which took place in 1775 and resulted in the discovery of Cape Engano and Guadalupe Bay. Next to these rank the expeditions of Artiga and Morel. We have already related what was done by Cook, La Perouse, and Marchand, so we can pass on to say a few words on the expeditions of Vancouver. This officer, who had accompanied Cook on his second and third voyage, was naturally appointed to the command of the expedition sent out by the English government, with a view to settling the disputes with the Spanish government as to Nootka Sound. George Vancouver was commissioned to obtain from the Spanish authorities the formal cession of this great harbor, of such vast importance to the fur trade. He was then to survey the whole of the northwest coast, fro degrees and lat, to Cook's River in 61 degrees and lat. Lastly, he was to give special attention to the Straits of De Fuca and the bay explored in 1749 by the Washington. The two vessels, the Discovery of 340 tons and the Chatham of 135, the latter under the command of Captain Broughton, left Falmouth on the 1st of April, 1791. After touching at Tenerife, Simon Bay, and the Cape of Good Hope, Vancouver steered southwards, sighted St. Paul's Island, and sailed towards New Holland, between the routes taken by Dampier and Marion, and through latitudes which had not yet been traversed. On the 27th September was sighted part of the coast of New Holland, ending in abrupt and precipitous cliffs, to which the name of Cape Chatham was given. As many of his crew were down with dysentery, Vancouver decided to anchor in the first harbor he came to get water, wood, and above all provisions, of which he stood sorely in need. Port George Roman III was the first reached, where ducks, curlews, swans, fish, and oysters abounded, but no communication could be opened with the natives, although a recently abandoned village of some 20 huts was seen. We need not follow Vancouver in his cruise along the southwest coast of Holland, as we shall learn nothing new from it. On the 28th November, Van Diemen's Land was doubled, and on the 2nd December the coast of New Zealand was reached, an anchor cast by the two vessels in Dusky Bay. Here Vancouver completed the survey left unfinished by Cook. A gale soon separated the Discovery from the Chatham, which was found again in Matavai Bay, Tahiti. During the voyage there from Dusky Bay, Vancouver discovered some rocky islands, which he called the Snares, and a large island named Opera, whilst Captain Broughton had discovered Chatham Island, on the east of New Zealand. The incidents of the stay at Tahiti resemble those of Cook's story too closely for repetition. On the 24th January, the two vessels started for the Sandwich Islands and stopped for a short time off Awahi, Waiahu, and Ottaway. Since the murder of Cook, many changes had taken place in this archipelago. English and American vessels now sometimes visited it to take whales or trade in furs, and their captains had given the natives a taste for brandy and firearms. Quarrels between the petty chiefs had become more frequent, the most complete anarchy prevailed everywhere, and the number of inhabitants was already greatly diminished. Map of the two Americas. On the 17th March, 1792, Vancouver left the Sandwich Islands and steered for America, of which he soon sighted the part called by Drake New Albion. Here he almost immediately met Captain Gray, who was supposed to have penetrated, in the Washington, into Fuca Strait, and discovered a vast sea. Gray at once disavowed the discoveries with which he was so generously credited, explaining that he had only sailed 50 miles up the strait, which runs from east to west till it reaches a spot where, according to some natives, it veers to the north and disappears. Vancouver in his turn entered Fuca Strait and recognized Discovery Port, Admiralty Entry, Birch Bay, Desolation Sound, Johnston Strait, and Broughton Archipelago. Before reaching the northern extremity of this long arm of the sea, he met two small Spanish vessels under the command of Quadra. The two captains compared notes and gave their names to the chief island of the large group known collectively as New Georgia. Vancouver next visited Nootka Sound and the Columbia River, whence he sailed to San Francisco, off which he anchored. It will be understood that it is impossible to follow the details of the minute survey of the vast stretch of coast between Cape Mendocino and Port Conclusion, in N-lat. 56 degrees 37, which required no less than 3 successive trips. Now, says the great navigator, that we have achieved the chief aim of the king in ordering this voyage, I flatter myself that our very detailed survey of the northwest coast of America will dispel all doubts, and do away with all erroneous opinions as to a northwest passage. Surely no one will now believe in there being a communication between the North Pacific and the interior of the American continent in the part traversed by us. Leaving Nootka to survey the coast of South America before returning to Europe, Vancouver touched at the small Coconut Island, which, as we have already observed, little deserves its name, cast anchor off Valparaiso, doubled Cape Horn, took in water at St. Helena, and re-entered the Thames on the 12th September, 1795. The fatigue incidental to this long expedition had so undermined the health of the explorer that he died in May, 1798, leaving the account of his voyage to be finished by his brother. Throughout the arduous survey, occupying 4 years, of 900 miles of coast, the Discovery and Chatham lost but 2 men. It will be seen from this how apt a pupil of Cook the great navigator was, and we do not know whether most to admire in Vancouver his care for his sailors and humanity to the natives, or the wonderful nautical skill he displayed in this dangerous cruise. While explorers thus succeeded each other on the western coast of America, colonists were not idle inland. Already established on the borders of the Atlantic, where a series of states had been founded from Florida to Canada, the white men were now rapidly forcing their way westwards. Trappers and coureurs des bois, as the French hunters were called, had discovered vast tracts of land suitable for cultivation, and many English squatters had already taken root, not, however, without numerous conflicts with the original owners of the soil, whom they daily tried to drive into the interior. Emigrants were soon attracted in large numbers by the fertility of a virgin soil and the more liberal constitution of the various states. Their number increased to such an extent that at the end of the 17th century, the heirs of Lord Baltimore estimated the produce of the sale of their lands at £3,000. And in the middle of the following century, 1750, the successors of William Penn also made a profit, 10 times as great as the original price of their property. Yet emigration was even then not sufficiently rapid, and convicts were introduced. Maryland number in 1750. Many scandalous abuses also resulted from the compulsory signing by newcomers of agreements they did not understand. Although the lands bought of the Indians were far from being all occupied, the English colonists continued to push their way inland, at the risk of encounters with the legitimate owners of the soil. In the north, the Hudson's Bay Company, holding a monopoly of the fur trade, were always on the lookout for new hunting grounds, for those originally explored were soon exhausted. Their trappers made their way far into the western wilds and gained valuable information from the Indians whom they pressed into their service and taught to get drunk. By this means, the existence of a river flowing northwards, past some copper mines, from which some natives brought fine specimens to Fort Prince of Wales, was ascertained. The company at once, i.e. in 1769, decided to send out an expedition, to the command of which they appointed Samuel Hearne. For a journey to the Arctic regions, where provisions are difficult to obtain, and the cold is intense, a few well-seasoned men are required, who can endure the fatigue of an arduous march over snow and bear up against hunger. Hearne took with him only 2 whites and a few Indians on whom he could depend. In spite of the great skill of the guides, who knew the country and were familiar with the habits of the game it contained, provisions soon failed. 200 miles from Fort Prince of Wales, the Indians abandoned Hearne and his 2 companions, who were obliged to retrace their steps. The chief of the expedition, however, was a rough sailor, accustomed to privations, so he was not discouraged. If he had failed the first time, that was no reason why a second attempt should not succeed. In March 1770, Hearne started again to try and cross the unknown districts. This time he was alone with 5 Indians, for he had noticed that the inability of the whites to endure fatigue excited the contempt of the natives. He had penetrate miles when the severity of the weather compelled him to wait for a less severe temperature. He had had a terrible experience. At one time to have, indeed, more game than can be eaten, but more often to have no food whatever and be compelled for a week at a time to gnaw old leather, pick bones which had been thrown aside, or to seek, often in vain, for a few berries on the trees, and lastly, to endure fearful cold. Such is the life of an explorer in these Arctic regions. Hearne started once more in April, wandered about the woods until August, and had arranged to spend the winter with an Indian tribe which had received him well, when an accident which deprived him of his quadrant compelled him to continue his journey. Privations, miseries, and disappointments had not quenched the ardor of Hearne's indomitable spirit. He started again on the 7th December, and penetrating westwards below the 60th parallel en lat, he came to a river. Here he built a canoe, and went in it down the stream, which flowed into an innumerable series of large and small lakes. Finally, on the 13th July, 1771, he reached the Coppermine River. The Indians with him now declared that they had been for some weeks in the country of the Esquimaux, and that they meant to massacre all they should meet of that hated race. An encounter very soon took place. Coming, says Hearne, upon a party of Esquimaux asleep in their tents, the Indians fell upon them suddenly, and I was compelled to witness the massacre of the poor creatures. Of 20 individuals, not one escaped the sanguinary rage of the Indians, and they put to death with indescribable tortures an old woman who had in the first instance eluded them. After this horrible carnage, says Hearne, we sat down on the grass and made a good dinner off fresh salmon. Here the river widened considerably. Had Hearne arrived at its mouth, the water was still quite sweet. There were, however, signs of a tide on the shores, and a number of seals were disporting themselves in the water. A quantity of whale blubber was found in the tents of the Esquimaux. Everything, in fact, combined to prove that the sea was near. Hearne seized his telescope and saw stretching before him a huge sheet of water, dotted with islands. There was no longer any doubt it was the sea. On the 30th June, Hearne got back to the English posts, after an absence of no less than a year and 5 months. The company recognized the immense service just rendered by Hearne by appointing him governor of Fort Prince of Wales. During his expedition to Hudson's Bay, La Perouse visited this post, and there found the journal of Samuel Hearne's expedition. The French navigator returned it, on condition that he would publish it. We do not know why its appearance in accordance with the promise given by the English traveler to the French sailor was delayed unt. Not until the close of the 18th century did the immense chain of lakes, rivers, and portages become known, which, emanating from Lake Superior, receive all the waters flowing from the Rocky Mountains and divert them to the Arctic Ocean. It was to the brothers Frobisher, fur traders, and to a Mr. Pond who reached Athabasca that their discovery is partially due. Thanks to their efforts, traveling in these parts became less difficult. One explorer succeeded another, posts were established, and the country was open to all comers. Soon after, a rumor was spread of the discovery of a large river flowing in a northwesterly direction. It was Alexander Mackenzie who gave his name to it. Starting on the 3rd June, 1789, from Fort Chippewyan, on the southern shores of the Lake of the Hills, accompanied by a few Canadians and several Indians who had been with Samuel Hearne, he reached degrees 45 and lat, where he heard that the sea was not far off on the east, but that he was even nearer to it on the west. It was evident that he was quite close to the northwestern extremity of America. On the 12th July, Mackenzie reached a large sheet of shallow water covered with ice, which he could not believe to be the sea, though no land could be seen on the horizon. It was, however, the Northern Ocean, as he became assured when he saw the water rising, although the wind was not violent. The tide was coming in. The traveler then gained an island at a little distance from the shore, from which he saw several whales gamboling in the water. He therefore named the island, which is situated in N lat. 69 degrees 11, Whale Island. On the 12th September, the expedition safely returned to Fort Chippewyan. 3 years later, Mackenzie, whose thirst for discovery was unslaked, ascended Peace River, which rises in the Rocky Mountains. In 1793, after forcing his way across this rugged chain, he made out on the other side the Takaches River, which flows in a southwesterly direction. In the midst of dangers and privations more easily imagined than described, Mackenzie descended this river to its mouth, below Prince of Wales Islands. There, he wrote with a mixture of grease and vermilion the following laconic but eloquent inscription on a wall of rock. Alexander Mackenzie, come from Canada overland, July 22, 1793. On the 24th August, he re-entered Fort Chippewyan. Mackenzie's first view of the North Pacific Ocean. Mackenzie's first view of the North Pacific Ocean. In South America, no scientific expedition took place during the first half of the 18th century. We have now only to speak of Condamine. We have already told of his discoveries in America, explaining how, when the work was done, he had allowed Boughner to return to Europe, and left Jussieu to continue the collection of unknown plants and animals which was to enrich science, whilst he himself went down the Amazon to its mouth. Condamine, says Maury in his Histoire de l'Académie des Sciences, may be called the Humboldt of the 18th century. An intellectual and scientific man, he gave proof in this memorable expedition of an heroic devotion to the progress of knowledge. The funds granted to him by the king for his expedition were not sufficient. He had 0 livres from his private purse, and the fatigue and suffering he underwent led to the loss of his ears and legs. The victim of his enthusiasm for science, on his return home he met with nothing but ridicule and sarcasm from a public who could not understand a martyr who aimed at winning anything but heaven. In him was recognized, not the indefatigable explorer who had braved so many dangers, but the infirm and deaf M. de Condamine, who always held his ear trumpet in his hand. Content, however, with the recognition of his fellow savants, to which Buffon gave such eloquent expression in his reply to the address at his reception at the French Academy, Condamine consoled himself by composing songs, and maintained until his death, which was hastened by all he had undergone, the zeal for information on all subjects, even torture, which led him to question the executioner on the scaffold of Damiens. Portrait of Condamine. Portrait of Condamine. Facsimile of early engraving. Few travelers before Condamine had had an opportunity of penetrating into Brazil. The learned explorer hoped, therefore, to render his journey useful by making a map of the course of the river, and putting down all his observations on the singular costumes worn by the natives of that little frequented country. After Orellana, whose adventurous trip we have related, Pedro de Ursua was sent in 1559 by the Viceroy of Peru to seek for Lake Parima and the El Dorado. He was murdered by a rebel soldier, who committed all manner of outrages on his way down the river, and finished his course by being abandoned on Trinity Island. Efforts of this kind did not throw much light on the course of the river. The Portuguese were more fortunate. In 1636, and Pedro Texeira, with 47 canoes and a large number of Spaniards and Indians, followed the Amazon as far as the junction of its tributary the Napo, and then ascended, first it, and afterwards the Coca, to within 30 miles of Quito, which he reached with a few men. The map drawn up by Sanson after this trip, and as a matter of course copied by all geographers, was extremely defective, and there was no other. At that time, the copy of a map drawn up by Father Fritz, a German missionary, came out in Vol. Roman 12, of the Letters Edifiants, a valuable publication, containing a multitude of interesting historical and geographical facts. In this map it was shown that the Napo is not the true source of the Amazon, and that the latter, under the name of the Maranon, issues from Lake Guanuco, 30 leagues east of Lima. The lower portion of the course of the river was badly drawn, as Father Fritz was too ill when he went down it to observe closely. Leaving Tarqui, 5 leagues from Cuenca, on the 11th May, 1743, Condamine passed Zaruma, a town once famous for its gold mines, and having crossed several rivers on the hanging bridges, which looked like huge hammocks slung from one side to the other, reached Loxa, 4 degrees from the line, and fathoms lower than Quito. Here he noticed a remarkable difference of temperature, and found the mountains to be mere hills compared with those of Quito. Between Loxa and Yin de Bracamoros, the last buttresses of the Andes are crossed. In this district, rain falls every day throughout the year, so that a long stay cannot be made there. The whole country has declined greatly from its former prosperity. Loyola, Valladolid, Yin, and the greater number of the Peruvian towns at a distance from the sea, and the main road between Carthage and Lima, were in Condamine's time little more than hamlets. Yet forests of coconut trees grow all around Yin, the natives thinking no more of them than they do of the gold dust brought down by their rivers. Condamine embarked on the Chinsype, wider here than the Seine at Paris, and went down it as far as its junction with the Maranon, beyond which the latter river becomes navigable, although its course is broken by a number of falls and rapids, and in many places narrows till it is but 20 fathoms wide. The most celebrated of these narrows is the Pongo, or Gate of Mansarich, in the heart of the Cordillera, where the Amazon has hewn for itself a bed only 55 fathoms wide, with all but perpendicular sides. Condamine, attended only by a single Negro, met with an almost unparalleled adventure on a raft in this Pongo. The stream, he says, the height of which had diminished 25 feet in 36 hours, continued to decrease in volume. In the middle of the night, part of a large branch of a tree caught between the woodwork of my boat, penetrating further and further as the latter sunk with the water, so that if I had not been awake and on guard at the time, I should have found myself hanging from a tree on my raft. The least of the evils threatening me would have been the loss of my journals and notebooks, the fruit of 8 years of work. Fortunately, I eventually found means to free my raft and float it again. Celebrated Narrows of Mansarich. Celebrated Narrows of Mansarich. Facsimile of early engraving. In the midst of the woods near the ruined town of Santiago, where Condamine arrived on the 10th July, lived the Zabero Indians, who had been for a century in revolt against the Spaniards, who tried to force them to labor in the gold mines. Beyond the Pongo of Mansarich, a new world was entered, a perfect ocean of fresh water, a labyrinth of lakes, rivers, and channels, set in an impenetrable forest. Although he had lived in the open air for more than 7 years, Condamine was struck dumb by this novel spectacle of water and trees only, with nothing else besides. Leaving Borja on the 14th July, the traveler soon passed the mouth of the Morona, which comes down from the volcano of Sangay, the ashes from which are sometimes flung beyond Guayaquil. He next passed the 3 mouths of the Pastaca, a river at this time so much swollen that the width of no one of its mouths could be estimated. On the 19th of the same month, Condamine reached Laguna, where Pedro Maldonado, governor of the province of Esmeraldas, who had come down the Pastaca, had been waiting for him for 6 weeks. At this time, Laguna was a large community, of some 1,000 Indians capable of bearing arms, who recognized the authority of the missionaries of the different tribes. In making a map of the course of the Amazon, says Condamine, I provided myself with a resource against the ennui of a quiet voyage with nothing to break the monotony of the scenery, though that scenery was new to me. My attention was continually on the strain as, compass and watch in hand, I noted the deflections in the course of the river, the time occupied in passing from one bend to another, the variations in the breadth of its bed, and in that of the mouths of its tributaries, the angle formed by the latter at the confluence, the position and size of the islands, and above all the rate of the current, and that of the canoe, now on land and now in the canoe, employing various modes of measurement, which it would be superfluous to explain here. Every instant was occupied. I often sounded and measured geometrically the breadth of the river and that of its tributaries. I took the height of the sun at the meridian every day, and I noted its amplitude at its rising and setting wherever I went. On the 25th July, after having passed the Tigray River, Kundaman came to a new mission station, that of a tribe called Yamios, recently rescued from the woods by the fathers. Their language is difficult to learn, and their mode of pronouncing it extraordinary. Some of their words are 9 or 10 syllables long, and yet they can only count up to 3. They use a kind of pea shooter with great skill, firing from it small arrows tipped with a poison which causes instantaneous death. The following day the explorer passed the mouth of the Ucayale, one of the most important of the tributaries of the Maranon, and which might even be its source. Beyond it, the main stream widens sensibly. Kundaman reached on the 27th the mission station of the Amaguas, formerly a powerful nation, whose dwelling extended along the banks of the Amazon for a distance of 200 leagues below the Napo. Originally strangers in the land, they are supposed to have come down some river rising in Granada, and to have fled from the Spanish yoke. The word Amagua means flathead in Peruvian, and these people have the singular custom of squeezing the foreheads of newborn babies between two flat pieces of wood, to make them, as they say, resemble the full moon. They also use two curious plants, the floripondio and the curupa, which makes them drunk for 24 hours and causes very wonderful dreams. So that opium and hachich have their counterparts in Peru. Amagua Indians. Amagua Indians. Cinchona, Ipecacuana, Simaruba, Sarsaparilla, Guayacum, cocoa, and vanilla grow on the banks of the Maranon, as does also a kind of India rubber, of which the natives make bottles, boots, and syringes, which, according to Kundaman, require no piston. They are of the shape of hollow pears and are pierced at the end with a little hole, into which a pipe is fitted. This contrivance is much used by the Amaguas, and when a fete is given, the host, as a matter of politeness, always presents one to each of his guests, who use them before any ceremonial banquet. Changing boats at San Joaquin, Kundaman arrived at the mouth of Napo in time to witness, during the night of the 31st July or the 1st August, the immersion of the first satellite of Jupiter, so that he was able to determine exactly the latitude and longitude of the spot, a valuable observation, from which all other positions on the journey could be calculated. Pevas, which was reached the next day, is the last of the Spanish missions on the Maranon. The Indians collected there were neither all of the same race, nor all converts to Christianity. They still wore bone ornaments in the nostrils and the lips, and had their cheeks riddled with holes, in which were fixed the feathers of birds of every color. St. Paul is the first Portuguese mission. There the river is no less than 900 fathoms wide, and often rises in violent storms. The traveler was agreeably surprised to find the Indian women possessed of pet birds, locks, iron keys, needles, looking glasses, and other European utensils, procured at Para in exchange for cocoa. The native canoes are much more convenient than those used by the Indians of the Spanish possessions. They are in fact regular little brigantines, 60 feet long by 7 wide, manned by 40 oarsmen. Between St. Paul and Cori, several large and beautiful rivers flow into the Amazon. On the south, the Ude, Uruca, Teef, and Cori. On the north, the Putumayo and Upara. On the shores of the last-named river lives a cannibal race. Here Texera set up a barrier, on the 26th June, 1639, which was to mark the frontier between the district in which the Brazilian and Peruvian languages respectively were to be used in dealing with the Indians. Purus River and the Rio Negro, connecting the Orinoco with the Amazon, the banks dotted with Portuguese missions under the direction of the monks of Mount Carmel, were successively surveyed. The first reliable information on the important geographical fact of the communication between the two great rivers is to be found in the works of Kundaman and his sagacious comments on the journeys of the missionaries who preceded him. It was in these latitudes that the golden lake of Paraim and the fabulous town of Manoa del Dorado are said to have been situated. Here, too, lived the Manaus Indians, who so long resisted the Portuguese. Now were passed successively the mouth of the Madeira River, so called on account of the quantity of timber which drifts down from it, the port of Pauxis, beyond which the Maranon takes the name of the Amazon, and where the tide begins to be felt, although the sea is more than 200 miles distant, and the fortress of Tapios, at the mouth of a river coming down from the mines of Brazil, on the borders of which live the Tupinambas. Not until September did the mountains come in sight on the north, quite a novel spectacle, since for 2 months Condamine had not seen a single hill. They were the first buttresses of the Guiana chain. On the 6th September, opposite Fort Paru, Condamine left the Amazon and passed by a natural canal to the Xingu River, called by Father 500 Acuna the Paramaribo. The port of Curupa was then reached, and lastly Para, a large town with regular streets and houses of rough or hewn stone. To complete his map, the explorer was obliged to visit the mouth of the Amazon, where he embarked for Cayenne, arriving there on the 20th February, 1774. This long voyage had the most important results. For the first time, the course of the Amazon had been laid down in a thoroughly scientific manner, and the connection between it and the Orinoco ascertained. Moreover, Condamine had collected a vast number of interesting observations on natural history, physical geography, astronomy, and the new science of anthropology, then in its earliest infancy. We have now to relate the travels of a man who recognized, better than anyone else had done, the connection between geography and the other physical sciences. We allude to Alexander von Humboldt. To him is due the credit of having opened to travelers this fertile source of knowledge. Portrait of Alex de Humboldt. Portrait of Alex de Humboldt.